But yeah, speaking of Joe Biden, he has an involvement actually in what's going on in Colombia right now. It's because of him that the police in Colombia is this powerful, or at least a big contribution uh, to what he did. So here's an article from Left Voice. It's called "How Biden Funded Colombia's Deadly Police Regime." So I'm just gonna read a little bit of the passages here in this article, and then I'll ask my panel for their thoughts. So it says here the Duque regime, again, Ivan Duque is the president of Colombia, and the Manuel and Uribe regimes before it would not be what it is today if not for Plan Colombia, a policy that Joe Biden himself, while the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee was in 2000. This is a position that he was in back in 2000. This plan is responsible for increased violence in the region and the displacement of over 7 million Colombians since its inception. It is directly responsible for the creation and training of violent Escuadrón Móvil Antidistrib. It's hard for me to say this word in Spanish. Antidisturbios, so ESMAD police force. Biden's support for Plan Colombia 21 years ago was part of the international front of the U.S.'s war on drugs, which is responsible for both the militarization of much of Latin America and the racist mass incarceration of policing of millions of people of color in the United States. Plan Colombia provided $10 billion in military funding and the transfer of Black Hawk helicopters to Colombian security forces. The aid was used not only to fund military operations in Colombia's civil war, but also to provide huge bonuses to military officials under the guise of fighting drug trade. Colombian security forces used this aid to murder thousands of civilians, claiming that they were guerrilla soldiers killed in combat. In constructing the plan, Biden pushed for increased militarization time and time again, even going so far as to push back against efforts by some of his colleagues to redirect Colombian military funding to domestic drug treatment programs. Along with billions of dollars of funding, the CIA also trained battalions of the Colombian army to protect oil pipelines belonging to U.S. companies. Again, resources that is going to be used for capital is more important than human lives. Biden's policy towards Colombia came in the middle of a war between the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, and the Colombian government. Though the two sides agreed to an uneasy peace in 2016, the internationally recognized Colombian government will not be satisfied until it has surpassed all opposition, whether it comes from the FARC or protesters like those in the streets today. The Civil War was responsible for displacing millions of refugees and the deaths of thousands of civilians, many of which were indigenous communities. In crafting Plan Colombia, Biden made sure that he could influence the outcome of the conflict to better serve U.S. imperialist interests. As he said in the speech at the time, when I said, "Do we take sides?" the answer is yes, we take sides. And I just want to remind people, I reported this a long time ago, an article that talked about how when the U.S. police force was militarized during the Obama administration, a lot of those were Biden's pet projects. He served a key role in militarizing the police. And now we're seeing that he served a big role in militarizing the police in Colombia. Same thing in Israel. He's for the militarization of the police force and increasing the tech for the military forces in Israel against the Palestinians that are being occupied there. So it goes on to say a report in March 2002 found that a result of the conflict, an average of 20 violent deaths had taken place each day in Colombia. In other words, violence in the region only increased the implement of Plan Colombia. The report also focuses on the harm that U.S.-backed forces caused to the indigenous communities. With U.S. funding and support, the Colombian military destroyed crops the Kofan indigenous people relied on for subsistence through intense aerial fumigation, constructed oil pipelines through UA land, and armed paramilitary groups which used the excuse of the Civil War to repeatedly massacre indigenous people uninvolved in the conflict. This is a pattern that we see over and over again in the global south. Indigenous people that have nothing to do with the conflict, they just live there, and these police forces or these capitalists that want to build that want to destroy their land, build pipelines there, these indigenous people end up getting killed. Despite extensive documentation of the violence that Colombian security forces have inflicted on civilians throughout the past 2 decades, Biden bragged about his support for the imperialist project as recently as January 2020. While Biden has aggressively fought to fund the escalation of military force against the working and poor people of Colombia, he has been just as ardent a supporter of financial intervention in the region. In his decades in government, Biden has overseen the U.S.'s neoliberal offenses in Latin America, ensuring the creation of new markets for U.S. capital abroad, and working with financial institutions to make economies of these countries completely dependent on foreign aid and loans. Plan Colombia opened the way for the U.S. government and U.S. companies to work in tandem with the Colombian government to implement a wave of privatization and other neoliberal policies, increase poverty and unemployment to unprecedented levels in the country. In 2003, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, intervened to negotiate a $2.1 billion loan with the Colombian government on the condition that it would implement a series of austerity measures, including the restructuring of the pension program, cuts to the public sector workforce, and the privatization of a major bank. So while the U.S.-backed politicians and military officials ensured their own profits and those of U.S. capitalists, workers and oppressed people across the country were forced to suffer the consequences. And if his rhetoric on the campaign trail is any indication, Joe Biden's plans for Colombia have not changed. He remains a staunch crusader for U.S. imperialism in Latin America, promising to work with the Duque regime to quell dissent by killing activists, funding death squads, promoting foreign investment, and opening up Colombia for further privatization of and attacks on the country's crumbling social infrastructure. RJ, what are your thoughts on Biden playing a key role in this militarization of Colombia's police force?
I'm not surprised at all. I mean, what people keep forgetting is that Uncle Joe was in the same administration as Obama. Mm-hmm. You know, Obama was famous for giving the United States police force billions of dollars to, beat your kids who are trying to protest for black people getting killed by cops. Internationally, Obama created 5 wars after the 2 he inherited from George W. Bush. So this type of behavior overseas, I'm not surprised about. I mean, the United States imperialism in general, their whole idea is suppression. They're not trying to help other countries or police the world, that type of bullshit that we've been selling since Theodore Roosevelt was president. So that's how long really it's been. And even with the true Monroe Doctrine that basically said any country or place around the world that's on our side of the hemisphere, we could police. So that's how far back the American imperialism goes, in which how we feel the world should be subservient to us. And so in general, we do have to trying to find ways to put checks on these politicians like Biden, because even under Trump, I mean, Republicans don't give a fuck. I mean, they know that we know who they are. So they're not trying to pretend. That's why Donald Trump, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, these assholes, they can do this blatantly. But, even sometimes the Democratic base, they don't want to hear this type of stuff. So they have guys like Obama, they send him out there, pretty faced black man, charming and handsome. He could do imperialism. And a lot of times people on the left say that Obama makes conservatism look nice. And having a guy like Uncle Joe wearing aviator sunglasses, looking ice cream, he's the cool Joe. Of course they're probably doing something right. So Democrats in general play up this type of imperialism, make it look pretty, while Republicans, they make fascism more apparent. And so what's going on with Colombia and with Joe Biden, this is the same shit he's trying to do in Venezuela. Even during his
Yeah.
campaign, he was more hawkish on Venezuela than Donald Trump, the evil fascist dictator. Go figure. So I'm really worried because liberals don't give a fuck. You know,
Yeah.
conservatives don't either, but they're blatant in their hatred for those overseas. Liberals, now that the orange idiot is out of office, they're just happy with Uncle Joe and Auntie Kamala. So it's very hard to talk to these individuals as well. So I'm not really sure what the fuck we can do.
And I've said it on this show. Like me, I could go after Marco Rubio because he said that he stands with the Duque government, and I'm saying it here on the show. Yeah, Marco Rubio said that, and he's saying that the protesters are destabilizing the democracy there, even though the U.S. played a big hand in getting the Duque regime elected. But again, water is wet. We know what the Republicans are. We know what they'll stand for. That's obvious. Why we're pushing for these stories about Biden is because it's not as obvious to people that are in the left, sadly. And there are many people in independent media, like TYT, like the Majority Report crowd, that were shaming people if they didn't vote for Joe Biden. And this is what we get. We get more deaths and destruction. He has played a role in the past of creating death and destruction, and this is what you voted for. More death and destruction happening in the global south. To our people, like everybody here in this panel discussion, if you haven't noticed, comes from the global south. Is a descendant from the global south. So Skeptical Mantis and Fuzz, what do you guys think?
About what aspect specifically?
About the
Biden.
militarization that Biden participated in for the Colombian police forces, how there were people that were in independent media that called themselves leftists that were shaming people into voting for this, and then what we get is more death and destruction.
Yeah, it's insane. Yo, Fuzz, did you want to speak? I think you were about to say something.
No, so let you to go ahead.
Oh, I think what RJ said was pretty good. I don't have that much to add. I mean, yeah, I'm not surprised. Biden has been the architect of pretty much every damn terrible imperialistic policy in modern times. So, yeah, fuck Biden.
I mean, the same people who told us to vote for Joe Biden are the same ones, especially if we're talking about TYT, these are the same people who told us, you're irresponsible if you don't vote for Elizabeth Warren, the person who backstabbed Bernie in the primary. So it's just, these are very stupid, people. Jake's a cuck right now. And of course, now he's trying to, push the squad to do some shit after they have no leverage. So go figure. So stop watching TYT. I just hate the defenders of the squad. Like, they're politicians overall. So you can have the argument that, guys like Chuck Schumer, all these other Democrats, it's perfectly okay to call them out and push them. But when it's your precious squad progressives, we have to treat them nicer, even though they're just as well as politicians as anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I disagree with.
I can't wait for the day where it becomes just as obvious that the Republicans are not our side. It becomes just as obvious that AOC and the squad and all these independent media personalities on the left that bootlick the system, when that becomes just as obvious as how the Republicans are not on our side. I can't wait for that day. But since it's not that obvious, that's why I feel like I have to talk about it. And because the police force is killing indigenous people there, like we were just saying earlier, these people feel like they have no choice but to respond and defend themselves. This is similar, in my opinion, this is similar to what the UN Resolution 3743, which talks about how a nation that is under occupation or under colonial conquer has a right to defend itself via armed struggles. So that's what the indigenous people and a lot of the other Colombian citizens feel like they have to do. I showed you guys the videos, and there's more videos out there of the police in Colombia killing innocent people out in the street, just walking on the sidewalk, people that just have nothing to do with it. But yeah, anyway, Any
I
final
just want to add
comments
that in
before we
addition
leave?
to
Yeah.
indigenous people, it's also many African people in Colombia and
Yeah.
involved in these
Yeah.
protests. Right, we learned from watching the Black Power media stream recently that they claim that Colombia has the third largest population of African people outside of the African continent. The first was Brazil, the second was the United States, and the third was Colombia. The thing is, from my understanding, they tend to live in certain areas that are a bit more remote or, I guess, isolated, like especially on the coastal areas. So I guess, yeah, people don't think of Black people when they think of Colombia, because that's not what is shown on TV.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of African people. I didn't know that Colombia was third, but it doesn't surprise me, considering like their soccer team. Like I remember had a lot of black people in it. But yeah, I didn't know Brazil was ahead of the U.S. That's crazy. But yeah, I mean those people are victims too from the police violence. Any final words before we move on?
So I had actually wanted to mention that Plan Colombia sounds a little bit like the Drug Enforcement Agency and how it had an earlier expansion to be able to find a reason to export police into Latin American countries. And imperialism abroad has to be applied to imperialism at home because the exact same thing happened where the amount of police that were dedicated to finding non-existent drugs to make Black people look like a threat at home was a similar phenomenon that happened in the past, and the same thing is happening in Colombia with Plan Colombia. From how I'm understanding that plan being rolled out.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
basically, Plan Colombia, from my understanding, was like using discussion of fighting the drug war and decreasing cocaine production, and using that kind of as a cover to focus on targeting the left wing guerrillas and specifically a group called the FARC, FARC,
Yeah.
the FARC rebels. They were the main guerrilla group in Colombia.